Okay, let's dig into this. Your wallet, the whole economy really, is looking at a potentially massive shift.
Absolutely. We've got the 2017 tax cuts expiring in 2025.
Which means a big tax bill is pretty much baked in, right? It has to happen.
Almost certainly. That sunset provision forces the issue. It's a huge deadline looming.
So for this deep dive, we're going to try and cut through some of the noise around the 2024 election tax proposals.
Yeah, there's a lot out there.
We've looked at analyses from, PwC, PBS NewsHour, Newsweek, Semaphore, Fox News, Punchbowl News.
Even some chatter on places like tigerdroppings.com, which is interesting.
Right. And importantly, a really thorough report from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, the CBPP.
A key source for understanding the economic arguments.
Exactly. So our goal here is to, get past the political spin, the jargon, and figure out what these changes might actually mean for you, especially if you're a higher earner.
And uncover some maybe surprising angles, different takes on it all.
Okay, so where do we start? Interestingly, there's actually some agreement.
Yeah. It seems like it, at least for households making under, say, $400,000 a year.
Right. Both Trump and Biden seem to be saying, okay, for this group, let's keep the current tax cuts.
That seems to be the baseline. Keep those rates stable.
Politically, that makes sense. Nobody likes their taxes going up unexpectedly.
Exactly. And Biden especially has made a point of saying, no tax hikes below $400. Reassurance, basically.
People like stability.
They do. It avoids upsetting a huge chunk of voters right off the bat.
Okay, but above that $400,000 mark, that's where things get more complicated.
That's the real battleground. And remember, if nothing happened...
The taxes automatically go up for those higher earners, right?
Yeah.
Back to pre-2017 levels.
Precisely. That expiration date is the trigger. It forces Congress to make a choice.
So President Biden's choice is pretty clear.
Yes. He wants to raise that top individual income tax rate. Currently, 37%.
Back up to 39.6%.
Correct. For earnings over that $400,000 threshold.
And the reasoning. What's the argument there?
Well, it's framed around fairness, tackling the deficit, and paying for priorities.
Like childcare, paid leave, that expanded child tax credit.
Exactly. The argument is essentially that the 2017 cuts helped the wealthy disproportionately, so it's about rebalancing.
Okay. A sort of pay your fair share argument, combined with funding specific initiatives.
That's the core idea. More contribution from those with higher incomes for public services and, fiscal responsibility.
All right, so that's the Biden plan. Now, Trump's position, it seemed to, evolve a bit.
It has. The initial stance was simpler.
Just extend everything. Keep all the 2017 cuts, individual and corporate.
Yeah, that was the starting point. Lower taxes, stimulate growth, keep capital flowing. The traditional GOP line.
But now there's this newer development. Something about a potential increase.
Right. This idea has surfaced that maybe, just maybe, there could be a small tax increase, around 2.6%. But, and this is key, only for the very, very top. We're talking $2.5 million or more annually, or $5 million for couples.
So that would also take their rate up to 39.6%.
Potentially, yes. Matching Biden's proposed top rate, but kicking in at a much higher income level.
That's unexpected, maybe. Why float that?
Well, the stated rationale is interesting. It's supposedly to fund massive tax cuts for the middle and working classes.
And also protect Medicaid.
And protect Medicaid, yeah. It's a surprising mix. It allows him to say he's helping the middle class, paid for by the very top, while also addressing a major entitlement program.
Okay, so how's that going down within the Republican Party? I imagine there's some disagreement there.
Oh, absolutely. It's definitely causing some ripples. You've got clear divisions.
On one side.
The more, let's say, establishment conservatives, think Mark Short, Steve Scalise, they're generally against any tax rate increases.
Worried about hitting job creators, slowing the economy.
That's the main concern. The classic supply-side argument, don't raise rates, period.
But then there's another side.
Yeah, the more populist wing, maybe some moderates too, they seem more open to this idea.
Like Senator Hawley?
He's been mentioned. They see it as, maybe a way to pay for those middle-class benefits or the child tax credit expansion.
Or debt reduction. I think Rip Stutzman mentioned that possibility.
Right. If the revenue goes to paying down debt, that might sway some fiscal conservatives, so there's nuance there.
It highlights that internal tension, doesn't it? Between tax-cutting orthodoxy and maybe populist appeal or fiscal concerns.
Definitely. And you need consensus, right? 218 votes in the House, 51 in the Senate. It's not easy.
And Speaker Mike Johnson is Where on this?
He said he's not a big fan of the wealthy tax idea,
But
but he also acknowledged talks are ongoing. He's got to navigate these different factions in his caucus. It's a tough spot.
okay, so that's the political landscape. What about the economics, that CBPP report you mentioned?
Yeah.
What does it say about taxing high-income folks? Just to remind you, listening, the CBPP is a nonpartisan research group.
Yes, and their findings are really interesting because they often push back against some common assumptions.
Like what?
Like the idea that raising income taxes on high earners, at least within the ranges being talked about, would significantly damage the overall economy.
Okay, break that down. What about the argument that people will just work less if their taxes go up?
The CBPPP analysis suggests that's probably not a huge effect for high earners. Their decision to work is complex.
Not just driven by the marginal tax rate.
Right. Factors like job satisfaction, career trajectory, market demand, they all play a role. And some research even suggests their work hours are less sensitive to tax rates than lower or middle income workers.
Interesting. So a CEO isn't likely to just, quit because their top rate goes up a couple of points.
Unlikely, yes. The incentives are different at that level.
What about saving and investment? That's always a big concern. Higher taxes mean less capital available.
Again, the evidence, according to CBPP, isn't super strong that moderate tax hikes on the rich significantly reduce private saving or investment.
Really?
Yeah, and here's a key point they make. If that extra tax revenue is used to pay down the national debt, that could actually boost national saving and investment overall, because government borrowing crowds out private investment, so reducing borrowing helps.
Okay, that makes sense. What about the small business argument? That's one you hear constantly. Don't tax the rich, you'll hurt small businesses.
The CBPP report tackles that directly. They argue it's often overstated.
How so?
Well, first, relatively few small business owners are actually in those very top income brackets that would be affected.
Okay.
And second, many businesses already benefit from various deductions and subsidies, sometimes paying very low effective rates anyway. Plus, the evidence that general small business tax breaks, not targeted ones for startups, are a huge engine for job growth is, well, it's debatable.
Right. And entrepreneurship, starting new businesses, does that take a hit?
The evidence there is surprisingly mixed. Some studies, believe it or not, suggest higher taxes might even encourage people to become self-employed.
Encourage? How does that work?
The theory is kind of like an insurance effect. Higher taxes can mean the government shares more of the downside risk by reducing income volatility, making the leap into entrepreneurship feel a bit less risky.
Wow. Okay. That's definitely counterintuitive.
It is. It challenges the simple narrative.
So looking back historically, does the CBPP find a clear link between high top tax rates and bad economic times?
Not necessarily. They point to periods in U.S. history with much higher top rates that still saw strong growth and job creation.
So it's not automatic doom and gloom.
It seems not. What seems to matter more is how the tax revenue is used. If it funds productive investments or reduces deficits, that supports growth.
Versus just extending tax cuts without paying for them.
Right. The CBPP argues that's more likely to hinder growth in the long run because of the rising debt burden.
Okay, one more economic point. Tax avoidance. If rates go up, don't people just find more ways to hide their income?
That definitely happens. Higher rates do lead to less reported taxable income. That's clear.
So is that a major problem?
The analysis suggests it's mostly about timing income differently or using more complex avoidance strategies. It's less about people stopping actual productive economic activity, like working or investing.
So it's a cost, but maybe not as bad as killing real economic activity.
That's the argument. And importantly, even accounting for avoidance, raising rates from current levels is still projected to bring in significant revenue.
So the takeaway from the CBPP analysis seems to be maybe raising taxes on the wealthy isn't the economic catastrophe it's sometimes made out to be.
That's a fair summary. They argue high-income folks benefited most from prior cuts, can afford to contribute more, and that shielding them means the burden of deficit reduction falls harder elsewhere.
On lower and middle income families, through spending cuts, presumably.
Exactly. They also mention broadening the tax base, closing loopholes, often affects high earners and improves efficiency. And ultimately, they argue the cost of ever-rising debt is potentially much higher than modest tax increases at the top.
Okay, let's shift gears quickly to corporations. Those tax cuts from 2017 are also expiring.
Yes, the corporate rate cut was a big piece of that bill.
And here the difference seems starker between the candidates. Biden wants to
raise the rate from 21% currently up to 28%.
And Trump
wants to keep it at 21%, extend that cut.
So a clear divide. Arguments for raising it focus on corporate responsibility funding government.
Right. And arguments for keeping it low center on global competitiveness, encouraging investment here in the U.S.
Okay. And lastly, what about lower-income families, families with kids? The child tax credit comes up a lot.
It does. President Biden wants to bring back the expanded version from 2021. That was a big temporary boost for many families.
Is there any common ground there?
Well, interestingly, there was, or maybe still is, a bipartisan framework to expand the CTC. It seemed to have support.
But it's stalled.
Reportedly stalled in the Senate, yeah. Which just shows how tough getting any tax bill through can be, even parts with apparent agreement.
Even when it helps low-income families with kids, who often get bipartisan lip service.
Exactly. Though some Republicans are apparently talking about extending an expanded CTC, maybe funded by that wealthy tax we discussed earlier. It's all interconnected.
And economically, tax cuts for lower-income folks tend to get spent faster, right? More immediate stimulus.
Generally, yes. Especially in a sluggish economy, they have a higher propensity to consume, so it boosts demand more quickly per dollar than cuts for high earners who might save more.
So, looking ahead to 2025, it really feels like a must-pass situation, as PwC put it. The expirations force the issue.
Republicans seem united on needing a tax bill. That part isn't controversial for them. The fight is over what's in the bill.
Right. Different ideas about debt, deficits, the role of taxes versus spending.
Yeah, you have fundamentally different philosophies colliding over this deadline. One side leans more towards spending cuts. The other considers revenue increases as part of the solution, too.
And that stalled child tax credit bill is kind of a cautionary tale about how hard this will be.
A very good example. Even with potential overlap, gridlock is easy.
Okay, so summing up, the big clash is really over corporations and high-income earners. Biden wants increases there.
And Trump, while wanting broad extensions, is now maybe floating that targeted increase on the very wealthiest, possibly to fund other cuts.
And the economic research, like from CVPP, suggests maybe raising taxes at the top isn't automatically bad for the economy.
And might even be beneficial if the money is used well, like for deficit reduction or smart investments. It complicates the simple narrative.
It really does. Okay, so here's something for you, the listener, to chew on. With these tax cuts expiring and these very different visions on the table, what fundamental principles about fairness, about economic growth, should really guide the decisions that are inevitably coming? Decisions that will directly shape your finances and the country's path forward.